Hello. This is the fourth of a series that I'm doing on coping with change, and the subject this time is the modern world. I mentioned the last session that it's common to divide the history of Western thought into three ages: the pre modern age, the modern age, and the postmodern age, which we have now entered. And the reason I'm talking about these eras of history is because they define reality differently. And so when we're in a change between one era and another, people are on different sides of the fence on how they define reality, how they look at meaning, those kinds of things, which can make society very difficult to manage for a while. So I want to talk about the modern period. We're looking at 1500 or so. Sometimes we look at about 1600, but at any rate, there's a period there. Or let's say 1620, just to make it a definitive date, though there is no real definitive date, when things begin to move from pre-modern thought to modern thought. Last time when we looked at pre-modern thought, we were saying that the operative word is synergy, systems. Everybody's a part of a whole. Everything is part of a whole, and all the whole is contained in the parts. The way of thinking about the modern era is to look at the individual things rather than systems. So we're interested not in the forest, but in the trees. There is no such thing as a forest. The forest is just a collection of trees in the modern way of thinking of things. And there's not really a universe. We call it the universe because that's the biggest thing we can imagine, and it's got a lot of stuff in it. But the individual is what we're interested in. We might say then that reality is thought of as being bottom up rather than top down, as it was in the pre-modern era. Text rather than memory is the operative instrument in the modern age. We want to write things down. The printing press is invented. Everything becomes about the text. Even in religion before, that was not the case. It wasn't the case in Christianity, for example. The Bible was always revered, respected, carried into the church, and with great fanfare. It would be read several times during the service, and it was memorized by people, particularly certain books. Most Christians that could memorize the Psalms, for example. Great portions of Scripture was committed to memory because you heard it nearly every day. But it wasn't a book that you owned. And so in the modern era, this changed, and the text become central to things. And it was not true only in religion, but in political life. So constitutions became important. There was no idea of a constitution in times past. It was just our way of doing things. And so the text becomes very, very important. Maybe one way of thinking about the modern age is the country we're living in. It become possible to think of the United States, for example, being founded not only a new nation, but a new kind of nation. It was not a nation that was birthed in language or a certain ethnic group, and its origins were lost in mist of history, like we think of China or India. These are nations that have been around as long as anybody can remember. We don't really know a date when they begin, but we know when the United States begins. There's a date, and there's a text. There's two texts, actually. There's the Declaration of Independence, and then there's the Constitution of the United States, and these define a nation purposefully coming into existence. And what's its purpose? It's for the furtherance of the good of the individuals that comprise it. And this is a new way of thinking about nationality or groups of any kind, that a group exists for the flourishing of the people who belong to the group. And therefore, groups are founded by individuals. In the Declaration of Independence, this is stated very strongly that the nation exists, among other things, for the pursuit of happiness of the individuals that are in the nation. And then in the Constitution, we need to note that this is not a nation founded by God. This is a nation whose founding is witnessed by God. God is evoked in shadowy ways. But the founders of the nation is stated very clearly in the opening. We, the people. God's not founding this nation. I know that as a Christian, we think the colonists came and they came for religious purposes and they cared about a nation that would reflect the ways of God and so forth. All that's perfectly true. But the founding of the nation as a political act was very clearly stated, was an act of individuals. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And so the idea that individuals create groups for the good of those individuals means that the group as such does not really exist in the modern age. It's a figment of the imagination, and it's useful for as long as the people who comprise it feel that it's useful. This is a very different way of looking at nationhood or family or church than had been conceived in the pre-modern era. In the pre-modern era, God starts a church, and of course, Christ starts a church. It says in Matthew, "On this rock I'll build my church." So this is an act of God, and then people are invited into it. But in the modern age, churches and denominations are founded by people to further the cause of God. And it's a very different kind of way of thinking about one's faith. And ultimately, even the family has to justify its existence as to how it is caring for the individuals within it. That's where we get the terms like functional and dysfunctional family. This is machine language. And indeed, the operative word of the modern age is machine. You can assemble individual things and create a machine, but you don't start with the system and then look at how the individuals fit into it. You do it the opposite. And I mentioned in the last episode how that until fairly modern times in most countries, you send a letter by saying you send it to the country, then to the city, then to the area of the city, then to the last name, the family name, and then to the individual you're sending it to. Exactly the opposite as we send mail in the modern era and in a country like the United States, because the individual always comes first. Now, at the end of the modern era, and this, of course, this could go on, and I'm sure your patience may be stretched already too thin. But at the end of the modern era, this focus on the individual had collapsed the idea of any kind of meaning of the whole. So we had become so individualized that the individuals themselves began to feel a loss of meaning. There was no particular narrative that tied people together or that made life worthwhile. We were thinking more and more that we're creating our own kind of sense of what meaning is about. And of course, that prepares us for the pre-modern age, which is, again, a very different way of looking at reality. Now, most of us my age, we think in modern categories. All the things I've mentioned here today, and I could mention many more, particularly when it comes to science and technology and the idea of machines and engineering. This is modern terminology. And we that's what we would call common sense, I think, people my age. That the ideas and assumptions of the modern age are common sense. But they weren't common sense to the people of the pre-modern era, and they're not common sense increasingly to people in the postmodern era. There's another kind of common sense. Common sense just means the ideas about reality that we hold in common. And so you can say common sense changes in these three different eras. And so if you are my age and you're talking to your grandkids, and many times you're kind of looking at each other like, what the heck did you just say, and what does that mean? You use terms different ways. You think of family different ways. You think of individual in different ways. Think of sexuality for sure in different ways. And so I mentioned last episode that in many ways Christianity is an ambassador for and a carrier of pre-modern thought. And I think that's an attribute of Christianity. A lot of people disagree with me about that. Anyway, we will catch up on our next session when we talk about postmodernism, what it is, And I thank you for joining in to this session and putting up with this extreme nerdiness.